Hello. Our story begins on a mission to the Outer Rim. Lord Vader was landing at a separate planet far away from the rest of the galaxy to hunt yet another Jedi. He was amped up. He felt as comfortable as he'd ever feel inside of his suit, and it led him to feeling like a true monster. A concoction created in a Coruscant lab to do one thing, his master's bidding. Vader waited for the Lambda shuttle to land, and when it did, he walked out, with his lightsaber ignited. The Jedi they had tracked was one of extreme importance to the Elder Order. Vader knew this Jedi by reputation, because they had teachings that many younglings followed. They were a master of the arts, and like Kirak Infla, he had taken on himself a spiritual journey. This specific master was a Rodian Jedi, and he wasn't out here on a bearish vow. Vader knew that this moment would challenge him to all of his abilities, likely being the most intense fight since his encounter with Eth Koth. Vader stormed down the ramp of the shuttle, his lightsaber ignited in hand, and looked out over the barren landscape that this Jedi called home. Vader's breathing is all that could be heard, as he stopped and looked around. A slight breeze crossed the flatlands and his eyes darted from side to side, sensing outwardly and only feeling nothing but death. Perhaps his mission wasn't in need of an actual duel, which would be disappointing. This Rodian Jedi was once battle master of the Jedi Order before Sindralig, so Vader was hopeful that he could actually have an actual challenge. Vader just walked out towards the sign of the camp, for what felt like hours. They typically landed the ship a little ways away from the Jedi encampment, because in some ways Vader preferred the chase more than the actual killing. It gave him a chance to control the power that he didn't have anywhere else in his life. The Dark Lord stopped and searched around. There was smoke coming out of a fire pit, meaning that the Jedi was here recently, but there was no sign of them, which was odd. He scanned the environment, making sure the Jedi attacker didn't find an advantage, but there was none to be had. There was no way for this Jedi to be a hidden attacker because it was a flat land. It was open as far as the eye could see, so he couldn't jump him from above or anything. He walked around the tent, his lightsaber still in hand, but no longer buzzing with energy. He heard absolutely nothing. It was like his own footsteps, his own breathing, and the life of the planet were silenced by the abyss of the system. Vader walked around the tent to see nothing, but just more emptiness. To make sure he wasn't totally alone, Vader looked back around to make sure the Lambda shuttle was still where it was. And it was. There were two pilots on the inside waiting for him to return, so that they could take him on his next location, whether it be the destroyer or Vader's castle. He looked at it and then to the massive tent. It wasn't like a small tent. It was a living quarters, created and provided by the Jedi Temple. People always gave gifts to the Jedi. Before the death of Qui-Gon, Chancellor of Valorum was trying to give the Jedi Order high-class boots because it would be a good sponsorship for a core-bred company. The Jedi obviously rejected that proposal, but still, free is free, and this little home here that was far from little was also free and given to the Jedi. Vader stepped around the side and peered in through an open slit in the door. The tent was still a bit loose and the windows were closed with flaps. Vader towered inside of the abode, so he had to bend down a little bit so he didn't graze the ceiling with his head. He looked over and saw a shelf. On it were artifacts and holocrons. On another shelf was an image of the Rodian and Master Yoda. They were inside of a training hall. What Vader saw next made him assume why this location was so silent. There was a creaking inside the home, like the swaying of a boat. Vader stepped towards another shelf, and on top of a medicine book was a bloody handprint. It also slipped down to the floor, where the hands could be seen on the ground. This confused Vader, but he followed them and stopped at an empty bed, where the Jedi Master had seemingly collapsed after exerting so much energy. The weird thing is, there wasn't a sign of anything or anyone inside of this abode. Vader moved around and searched the adjacent room. It was a Jedi's meditation chamber, and it also was empty. This time, though, empty of blood. Maybe the Jedi was feeling better. Vader turned around and jumped a little, seeing a statue about his height in the room across the hall from him. He looked around the meditation chamber once more, and then continued on for his hunt of the Jedi Master. He stepped out of the room and felt called to look to his right, to where he came from, and he did, yet there was nothing. Something was weird here. The Force, for him, was out of balance. This Rodian Jedi Master was known for his non-traditional usages of the Force and how he harmonized with it. An exceedingly talented battle master, but could be best described as weird. Always attempting rituals that weren't sanctioned by the Council or testing the Force in the ways that only Night Sisters would. Vader never believed in such magic, so he just continued along, walking up to the Temple Guard statue, the first student of the Battle Master. The individual Temple Guard had gotten ill, and it was an incurable illness. It was through this death that the former Battle Master became obsessed with the medicines of the Force. Vader looked away and saw a washroom, though there was still no one in here. The swaying felt before entered his mind again, but there was nothing to see. As Vader stepped into the room, he saw a hole in the side of the tent, one where there was more blood, but it was scattered, like the individual had face-planted into the wall and had torn through without any direction. Vader got antsy, believing that he had startled the Jedi Master with his arrival. As he stepped out, there was again nothing. He looked to the side, where he had just been, without fully rounding the tent before turning back. How odd. Vader decided to return to the vessel. Inside the cockpit of the ship, the two Imperial pilots were playing a game of sabacc with each other. They were just betting credits and food slips, essentially their meal counts inside the destroyers. Troopers got free food, but they had a limited number of meals per month to use, similar to what would be seen at a university. Vader had no clue that they were playing sabacc. He actually did, but he radioed in and told them that the Jedi had vanished, being that Vader didn't see anything inside the tent or around it. He expressed that he was getting ready to return for the departure, and they readied the engines, which cut through the thin air of this barren world. Vader walked across the flats, seeing nothing. The two Imperial pilots got back to work on the sabacc game. It wasn't the first time they had done this. Their rituals consisted of betting with each other until they heard Vader's first boot stomp on the ramp, and then they'd stop and clean everything up. It was effective because they could get their last bets out and jump right back into being the Emperor's pet's escort. Vader stormed across the flats, and just as he was about to enter the ship, he stopped. Something didn't feel right. He was very aware the pilots played sabacc, but he didn't really care. He liked the illusion that they thought he'd give any sense of care about it, the fear he might cause by knowing. Vader's eyes turned back and scanned the barren lands behind him and saw nothing again. Something weird was going on here. He turned back and was jumped. His armor was pierced over his shoulder and he was thrown back to the ground. He threw his fist forward, beating a creature off of him. Vader was able to lob the individual away from him, and as he did, his eyes found the Rodian Jedi Master. Vader felt his shoulder and pulled his hand back, revealing blood crawling down his glove. It wasn't just his, but there was a dark goo that sat within it. His lightsaber ignited and the creature charged him. With a swing of his arm, the Jedi Master fell lifelessly to the ground in pieces. Vader took the body to see that the dark goo that was on his hand was also on the creature. He walked over the body and into the bay of the Lambda shuttle and sat down, requesting transit to the Devastator. It was closer and he needed a bacta tank. While Vader could be mad at the two troopers for not seeing this, he wasn't at the current moment because he was confused. That confusion started to rapidly become warped. Vader was fending something off. His body was rapidly using the Force to reject this pathogen, but it wasn't working. When they arrived outside of the Star Destroyer, after about an hour or two of travel through hyperspace, Vader was struggling. His body was aching more than it ever had. His shoulder was pulsating and he was very confused. Inside of his mind, Anakin and Vader were slowly being consumed by a ravenous monster. The ship docked and Vader stumbled out of it, slipping on the ramp and catching himself as he landed firmly on his feet before walking deeper into the ship. The two pilots had no clue why he was acting so distant, for lack of a better word. Vader knew, at the bare minimum, that he needed to get to the bacta tank and heal up. As he stumbled across the halls, he stepped into the medical room, where an Imperial medic greeted him. It was one of the only individuals permitted to see Anakin without the armor, and so Vader slipped down. His armor was removed and he was placed into the bacta tank. The Imperial medic stood in the room with a datapad, as Vader behind him closed his eyes and tried to relax. His body kept aching unlike ever before. It was all internal, and he didn't say a word to the Imperial medic, who was getting back around to examine him. He walked up to the tank and looked in, examining the little scar on his shoulder and trying to figure out what it was. The gunk that was crawling out of the Rodian's mouth was also on Vader, and while this medical officer had no knowledge of the dead Jedi, he found this to be odd. He walked away with the little goo and saw that there was no known reports of this black liquid that was starting to spread across the bacta tank. The officer didn't even notice it, but behind him, his patient's body was beginning to convulse. Vader was rapidly shaking like he was freezing, and despite his best efforts to slow down the rise of this growth, he couldn't. His mind slowly taken over, and his soul was destroyed by the corruption of this monster. Vader sat dormant inside of the Bacta tank, just bobbing around with the current. His eyes opened, and there was nothing behind them. No spark, no energy, no life. The creature looked around, calling out like a rabid animal in a broken way. The creature's noises didn't alert the focused Imperial officer, who focused intently on the data he had and was diagnosing from some of the black goo he found on the ground and got from the tank. There was absolutely no knowledge on where this came from. No database, even in the Empire, had anything that could distinguish its origin. He crossed his arms and continued to search for more information. Behind him, the creature without any arms or legs started to sway back and forth, looking for a chance to get out, but there was nothing. He was just lifelessly floating like a buoy in a calm rising tide. Outside of the medical bay, the two pilots that were with each other went to the barracks, their stormtrooper outfits still on, and they sat down to see how many chips one collected and how many the other lost. After all, they'd been playing for a good 20 or 30 minutes before Vader returned to them. One of the troopers was named Ajal, and the other was Osiris. They sat down and threw their chips out in front of them. Their captain walked by and asked why they were betting, and they told him that it wasn't an issue, Vader permitted it. The captain glared at them, even though the helmet was still on, before walking away. The two of them continued to play their game with each other, eventually getting to a point where they were both even. Inside of the medical bay, the Imperial officer turned around to see Vader's body bouncing off the corners of the tank. He ran over to ask Vader what was bothering him, and when he did, the body of Vader turned over and revealed a sickened face, one far worse than he'd ever seen before. The officer stepped back cautiously as the creature bashed its head against the tank, forcing it to reverberate and start to crack. The officer looked for a weapon and started out of the room, looking down both hallways and seeing no one. Of course, no one was awake. It was nighttime, and most of the crew was either eating or sleeping. Ajal and Osiris were next to each other bottom bunks, and they were quietly playing, so no one could hear them, but they were about to get some food as it was. The Imperial medic looked to the sides and then back to the knocking against the glass tube that progressively got louder and louder. As a medic, it wasn't his duty to kill, but this wasn't Vader, and he could see it within the eyes, so he ran out of the room, closing the door and rushing towards the armory. At this current moment, the ship was entering hyperspace. They are making a return to Coruscant because the Emperor always preferred that Vader bring his trophies back to him. Also, there was an Imperial meeting that was about to happen. The deckhands on the bridge did their captain's orders and everything was set. Inside the cafeteria, Ajal and Osiris got their food and sat down at a table alone. They were speaking about random excitements. Like the clones, there were stormtrooper bars across Coruscant, and they were going to hit this one up when they got back. Ajal had her head back and leaned against a wall, and she picked at the cold food while Osiris dug in. They were best friends. They were squad mates at the drill school and happened to get assigned to the same destroyer, even assigned to be Vader's personal escort. What a nightmare. They were simply enjoying the non-combative era they lived in. Ajal asked Osiris if Vader seemed a little different today when they came back. He shrugged his shoulders. Who knew? Anyone could have something different to react to. She responded with a confused, "What?" That didn't make any sense. He rubbed his eyes. Maybe it didn't. Osiris expressed that he did hear a slight commotion before Vader got onto the ship, but that was about it. She rubbed her chin, wondering if they had missed something. It was unlikely, but after all, they locked the cabin, and they were playing sabacc, so who really knows. Ajal told Osiris that she was going to look at the ship and see if they did miss anything, asking if he wanted to join. He shook his head. He was going to stay here and get another round of food. She gagged in a disgusted way. It wasn't that the food was cold, it was that this particular meal was disgusting. She threw her helmet back on and walked away. She locked her blaster onto her belt and sauntered through the hallways, eventually finding a trail of blood and following it into the hangar bay. Inside the medical facility, the medical officer returned with his blaster pistol and found nothing and no one. He was so confused, but everything was gone. Not just Vader, but the suit that he had lived within. What the officer noticed is the fact that the Bacta tank was broken open. Bacta was all over the floor, but the Vader suit had seemingly been put onto the man that was no longer within the suit. He looked from side to side, searching for Vader and then running out of the room and finding no one. He didn't know what to do, so to not raise alarms, he ran to the bridge. He needed to explain this to the deck officer. At the same time, Ajal walked into the Lambda shuttle they used to take Vader to and from the Outer Rim world. She walked up the ramp and saw a trail of blood stop at Vader's seat. Something was weird about this. Why didn't he tell them that he was injured? And why was his blood black? Stormtroopers always hypothesized about what Vader looked like under the suit. They always assumed human, but now, maybe not. She looked around for any sign of the commotion, but found nothing. The bleeding just led to the medical bay, which she wasn't going to go and check on because it was going to be taken care of by Vader's medic, the person that was allowed to see Vader without the suit. She decided to just go back to the cafeteria for the time being. The medic, on the other hand, ran into the bridge and found no one. He was just confused. His blaster pistol raised and he walked around the room, looking for anyone. When he found nothing, he walked through the catwalk, looked behind data tables and everything. The entire bridge had been cleared. Something was... When Ajal walked back into the cafeteria, Osiris was sleeping, so she pointed her fingers in the guns and walked up behind him and jabbed him in the sides, forcing him to rise with exceptional speed. He turned around and looked at her with bloodshot eyes, telling her that wasn't funny. Ajal was on the floor laughing because he had a true startle. Nothing beats a tase. She found herself on the adjacent table laughing away with a twist in her stomach. It hurt so badly to laugh because it was just that funny. Osiris had a big problem with it, but whatever, fine, she got him, haha. He got up and dumped what little remained of his food into the trash and they prepared to leave. The cafe was empty by now, and the only other individuals who were in here had already gone to sleep or to train. Ajal suggested a late night workout to tease him some more, but Osiris was ready for the big nap. They would have to be at their best tomorrow. Being at Coruscant always entailed some sort of presentable nature, not to mention his desire to stay up late and hit the clubs, and also forget where you were the following day. She laughed. That was a great idea. The two of them started towards the armory. As they were walking there, they found the halls to be silently empty. It was a weird feeling. Not that these two were night owls to begin with, but it was a little eerily silent in here. They walked to the armory to deposit the weapons, and when they opened the door, they saw someone standing silently in the room. The two of them called out, asking if the individual was alright. The man turned around. It was a man wearing an officer's uniform putting on stormtrooper armor, and he nodded his head, asking them if they had seen anything. They shook their heads. His name was Mors. He explained to them that there was something going on here. They needed to get to the escape pods now and leave. Though they couldn't. They were in hyperspace. Mors threw his hands against the rack, before quietly looking back and rushing out of the room and looking down both hallways to make sure nothing heard that. They asked Mors what his problem was, and he looked at them, telling them that they needed to go. Something had gotten out. It was a plague or something, and it was flesh-eating. It turned regular people into undead creatures. Ajal and Osiris looked to each other, and then thought that this dude was mocking them. Mors ran back in, grabbing a heavy rifle and telling them to follow him if they wanted to stay alive. The two of them didn't really take him seriously, but sure, if something was going on, why not stay with a lunatic? They could use him as cannon fodder if something actually was happening. The three of them trotted down the hallways and stopped. Mors was becoming more and more paranoid. He looked from side to side, checked everything around him, and then Osiris asked him where this was coming from. Mors explained that he was new to station here. He happened to come in when they were on the planet with Vader. But not too long ago, he was in the bridge and Lord Vader came in. But it wasn't him. He grabbed someone and started biting them before dropping them. Somehow it must have spread. He didn't know what happened himself. He panicked as he was walking into the room when he saw Vader do that. He was just coming from an adjacent hallway with information for the captain and saw Vader eating somebody. He did know for a fact that he was chased at some point, but he ducked into an elevator and tapped the button close to 100 times before nearly having a heart attack. He had just gotten himself down here because he needed to defend himself. Mors explained that he didn't want them to be killed by whatever this was, because that was more enemies for him and he didn't really care about them. Plus, they could all escape by staying together. Ajal then realized if this was real, their entire squad Their crew, all the troopers, were inside the barracks sleeping. They needed to wake them up and put the ship on high alert. Mors was a little iffy about this, but he agreed, believing it to be the right decision. They rushed from one end of the hall to the other. As they were doing this, cries and wails could be heard across the ship, people crying out in agony as they were silenced by groans from creatures without any sense of direction and only one motive. As they rounded the corner to the barracks, they stopped. There were howls and cries, as it sounded like a battle was happening on the inside of the room. Osiris walked forward and Ajal grabbed his arm, shaking her head. She told him that they were done for. Mors told them they needed to go and wait inside the escape pod room. The cries and screams then got louder, before being silenced by what was likely the end of the undead horde finishing their work. Mors turned around and his jaw dropped. He pushed the two of them back as he suggested they run now. Ajal looked over her shoulder to see Vader and his troopers flanking him, and they growled and hissed. Osiris looked back and let out a scream. Mors got frustrated before firing shots into the troopers and Vader. He couldn't believe Osiris would draw attention to them like that. The undead horde from the barracks were now alerted to this, as Mors told them to run. Ajal took point, rushing towards the end of the hall that led to a different part of the ship. As they ran by, Osiris and Mors fired at the troopers behind them. Some of them dropped, others did not. Vader continued to stand against the blasters, piercing his body. The undead horde from the barracks started to pile out, some of them faster and running, and others not. The three troopers turned on a heel and ran, following Ajal. She slipped going around the corner where Osiris helped her up, and darted towards the hangar. The death troopers behind them continued to chase after him, and they continued to fire back into their ranks until Mors pushed Ajal and Osiris into an adjacent room and locked the door. It was the medical bay. They had just done a huge circle from where Vader had started, though luckily, the medical bay had two exits. Osiris ran to the other side of the room to make sure their exit was clear, and it was. Mors made sure the doors were locked, and they tried to think of a way out of this. As they began to work on a way out, the doors started to get banged on. Groans came from the other side, as Ajal ran to the Bacta tank and rolled it over on its side, telling the two of them to steer clear. Bacta was highly flammable with the right materials. They looked to her as she rolled it over. Just as she prepared to get away from the doors, they were smacked open, and she slipped into Bacta, covering her leg. Mors pulled her out, and she fired her blaster into the Bacta as the zombies came in, lighting up the Bacta in a massive boom. The creatures who had just got into the room cried out in agony. She herself groaned in pain as her leg was lit on fire. She then rolled to the side to douse the flames. Osiris helped her off the ground as she limped away from the fiery zombies. Mors fired the heavy rifle at them as they slipped to the ground as Vader crawled through the burning creatures. Ajal limped into the corridor as she pushed herself off of Osiris and fired at incoming creatures. He turned back and did the same as Mors sealed the door shut and Vader's hulking hand slammed into it, grabbing Mors' shoulder plate and ripping it off. He looked down, he was alright, he wasn't injured, as Ajal got around and pelted Vader's arm, before following Osiris away. The three of them ran down the halls before getting blitzed again. Down an adjacent hall, they could hear stormtroopers firing away, calling out for reinforcements. Mors told them to stay away from them. They were a lost cause. As the trio were making their way around the ship, they slipped into a stairwell, and then the vessel exited from hyperspace. They ran down through the stairs before they started to get chased by the horde again. Some of the creatures fell, slamming into the stairs around them. Ajal limped her way down to the bottom, as they killed the surviving creatures that fell. When they exited the stairwell, they slipped through the engine block, killing off the few survivors and locking the doors as they did, before they dipped into the escape pod room, where the captain of their squad was waiting. The captain looked at the stormtroopers who entered and told them to reveal their faces. As they did, the captain fired a shot into Mors' chest and he fell over. The captain had one escape pod left, and it was for him and him alone. He was not going to test his life with those creatures. Ajal and Osiris fired their shots immediately and domed their captain, who fell back lifelessly to the ground. Ajal quickly looked into the pod, seeing that it was the only one left and it was empty. Not only was it empty, but the captain hadn't saved anyone. He cowardly hid down here and ejected all the pods to make sure the virus wouldn't be sent to the ground or another ship. Osiris called over to her and she ran back, helping Mors up and off the ground and into the escape pod before ejecting it. They didn't know what was going to happen next. Mors held their hands and told them that they needed to escape this hellhole They needed to get away and stay away. He looked at Coruscant as it rapidly approached them, as he wished that there was more to this, more than what they had seen. The two of them looked down and felt terrible shame when their short-term friend had died. They looked to each other, and Osiris told Ajal that he wanted out of this. He didn't want to be anywhere near this, or whatever was to come. She nodded her head. They were too close to death. They would get their medical treatment and eventually abandon a close contact Star Destroyer by stealing a Lambda shuttle. The Empire initially would care about something like this, but they didn't have time to care. The horde created by Vader would ravage a local Star Destroyer when their troops were able to get on board, thanks to a routine boarding because no one was in contact with them. And it only got worse from there. A creature would sneak into a Lambda shuttle and would find his way to the surface, where the plague would begin to shift outwards. Vader himself would be lost in the crowds of zombies. But once the first creature found home on Coruscant, the end of the civilization on the Ecumenopolis came. There was a large conference for Imperial officers, Moffs, and senators at the same time, which would cripple galactic interests. Initially, the undead hordes were slowed down by shock troopers, but after an intense battle of attrition and supply lines cracking due to the overwhelming growth of the horde, the war for Coruscant would fail, and the planet would be swallowed by carpet bombings and the rise of the undead. The Empire would remain strong, but they would just decide to cast off Coruscant. There was no point in fighting for it, and the planet became an abyss, a place where no one in the galaxy could go. There were survivors on the planet, but they too would eventually get eaten. Surviving Imperial leaders would scrounge together their resources to rebuild a government on Alderaan, where the Empire would soon grow back into its governmental power. Though without the key players who died on Coruscant, its government would slip into one that actually cared about their people. Osiris and Ajal would be eternally grateful for Mor's words. He had saved their lives twice, and that was something they could never repay. The two of them would continue to remain friends as the galaxy tried to move on past the Coruscant War. They knew that if they stayed with the fleet, they would have died on the surface, and it made their decisions feel rightfully made. They would never join the Empire again, and everything for the two of them and the galaxy would be alright, until someone went to Coruscant to find a plague and they became infected, bringing the disease to the galaxy, or not, just kidding. Anyways, that, my friends, is our Halloween special. Special thanks to all of my patrons: Wells, Darth Maelstrom, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Root36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D. Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Seth Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Lakes of Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Giveaway is down below. Go check it out. Super cool Star Destroyers. Let's get them out of here by Thanksgiving. Get your Star Destroyer below. Let's talk about the story. I mean, there's not really much to talk about. Just kind of keeping up with the zombie theme that we did last year. Last year was Clone Wars. This one was in the Empire era. Thought it was fun to kind of have Vader as like Patient Zero, Patient X. The idea of kind of following 2 stormtroopers, 3 stormtroopers in this is kind of fun. I feel like I don't really get to have a lot of fun with stormtroopers as individuals like I do the clones, so kind of fun to just work with the stormtroopers and surviving, but it's just kind of, you know, it's a fun, spooky little story. A lot of the inspiration is honestly kind of World War Z. Yeah, the last of the zombie movies. I don't know. Anyways, I love you all. I hope you all enjoyed, and happy Halloween.